So, but Brown in general, like who? So, they've read a little bit about Brown.
Okay, so the story is very simple. In the are you rolling?
Yeah.
Okay, in probably the end of the 18th century, James Brown, not that one. Oh. Saw in Britain. He was British, Scottish actually. So I guess these days the question of Scottish independence kicks in. He's a famous Scottish forester. He really saw that agriculture in Scotland and in the UK generally was suffering, and he believed that a return to a landscape in which the things that are bleeding from ecosystems, in a landscape where that bleeding could be stopped, it would be better. And he had seen from Frederick the Great's work in Germany 100 years before that if you put trees in a landscape, it does things to slow down siltation of rivers. It seems to ameliorate climate. It provides a material that can then be harvested as fuel or as a building material. And so he started doing experimental restoration of basically denuded land in Scotland. And he by himself, and later with his son William, planted some 20 million trees. And he wrote the first book on professional forestry called The Forester. It was published in 1847. I have a copy. It took me a long time to find it on Abe Books. And in that book he advocated virtually all of the things that are still being advocated by restoration ecologists today. That agricultural productivity, and especially the way agricultural productivity fuels industrial productivity, it all benefits from having a forested landscape, at least in part. Because what forests do is they slow down virtually everything. They slow down oscillations in temperature at the surface, they slow down wind, they slow down nutrient loss into rivers and streams. So all those things that support agriculture are lost when you get rid of trees, and when you put trees back in the landscape, all those things come back. Now it takes a while, and for the farmer who's cleared land, they hate the idea at the beginning, oh, you're gonna take away my profits because you're gonna prevent me from harvesting things on the land. And Brown tried to show the economics of that, and really it's a false economy to rape the land completely and then to hope that things are going to be better, that they're not going to be. So William Brown was raised in this culture, and despite the fact that William Brown's father was showing the error of European ways, in North America at the time, what we were doing was what the Romans did 1,000 years before in Europe. We were doing our very best to take the forested landscape and nuke it. Absolutely get rid of anything that looked like a forested landscape. And it was because the forests held wild animals that could eat your children, native people who would scalp your children, and the trees were sitting on land that could grow good crops. So there were three excellent reasons for getting rid of the forest. And they didn't just gently saw it up into boards. They blew it up, they burned it down, they did their best to utterly destroy the forested landscape, and this applied to southern Ontario. When this College of Agriculture was decided on in 1873, they put out advertisements across the Commonwealth and the British Empire at the time. I guess there wasn't a Commonwealth then. It was all British.
Pre-Commonwealth.
Yeah. Looking for people who could join the newly established College of Agriculture and define its direction. And William Brown, the son of James Brown, was the first one to be hired as what they called the farm superintendent. He was the first professor of agriculture. And he came here in 1874. And he was a big guy. He weighed about 350 pounds. One of his indulgences was scotch, and apparently he ended up getting fired for bringing in too many extra cases of scotch. And the president at the time he warred with, and he got fired for something to do with drinking too much scotch. Anyway, when he came here, he saw that everyone in North America was doing exactly what had happened in Great Britain and Europe, and he wanted it stopped. So he just went ballistic, basically. He looked at the landscape that Frederick Stone had created. I mean, except for the house and a few woodlots, this property was nuked. And he came here, William Brown came here and said to himself in his early papers, this is nuts. In fact, one of his early papers published in 1880, you'll laugh at this, he says, Southern Ontario has only been 50% reduced in terms of the amount of wilderness. 50% is gone, but 50% is still here. And so it's not too late.
If we act now.
If we act now, we can recover. We can plant trees along riparian systems.
Yeah.
We can plant them in farmers' fields. We can create livestock grazing areas that are protected from wind, and so on. But to jump ahead 100 years, in 1989, a publication by the MNR showed that the amount of wilderness in southern Ontario that was left was 0.07%. So William Brown did not win.
No.
But despite that, trees have, even if forests haven't come back, even if wilderness hasn't come back, trees are actually coming back in the landscape of southern Ontario, because a lot of the farming, just like William Brown predicted, that was on marginal land was eventually abandoned about 70, 60, 50 years ago. You still see abandoned farmland all over the place. Nonetheless, what William Brown decided to do, since this campus was showing the same features as the rest of southern Ontario, he decided to plant trees wherever he could. So he had teams of students planting where there's now the athletic center, where the Cotton Club is. The Homewood was originally HOLMWOOD. It was a plantation.
Really?
Right?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and they actually just harvested it about 10 years ago. They clear cut it.
Yeah.
So of all these plantations, he put in about 15 plantations. Some were monocultures, some were polycultures. Brown's Woods was put in, I think it was 1883 or 4. He put 13 species in here. He put 17 species in what we now call the dairy bush. And these were all, these weren't experiments by today's standards. None of these studies would have been published under today's sort of expectations of replication and randomization and all that. He just did things hoping that by monitoring them over time, you could see what happened. Sadly, of all those plantations, only 2 survived. There was a third one, a little tiny one, about half a hectare, where veterinary microbiology was. It was composed of European larch and Austrian pine. They cut it down 6 years ago, despite my complaints. So 2 survived. The one wasn't identified by the university until I brought it to their attention back in 1995. That's now called Brown's Woods. It's despite the fact that you get all these other academics who get buildings, I was going to be coarse there. All these buildings around campus are named after academics whose impact was almost zero on campus, in my view. The one guy that had never had anything named after him, even though he was the first one that was hired, was William Brown. So at least now, he has something named after him, and it won't die. All these other buildings will be torn down, they'll burn down, or they'll be renamed, not him. Brown's Woods, I think, is secure.